All right. Hello and welcome to Hack and Hustle, where we explore the ups, downs, and lessons learned in the world of cybersecurity sales and marketing with a deep dive on a new topic each week. I'm Anthony Johnson.
And I'm Brad Rager. And this week, I get to turn the mic and interview Anthony as we are joined by good friend Neil Saltman. These two guys literally wrote the book on how to sell cybersecurity products. We'll discuss what their top advice is, what has and has not changed since the book came out 3 years ago. We're excited to have you here, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
We're super pumped. Neil has this incredible track record in cybersecurity sales leadership, companies like Incillo, Anomaly, Sotero. He's now at Armis. Neil, we're super pumped to have you. Thanks for being here, man.
I'm excited to be here.
All right, so maybe just a little bit of background. Like, how did you guys come to know each other and develop this partnership that led to the book?
So that actually is funny. Is long time ago, I tried to sell to Anthony, and Anthony actually invited me into his office, and it was one of those meetings that just kind of stood out. I don't think Anthony even knows this. I don't think we've even talked about it. And we kind of stayed in touch. And every once in a while, I would just kind of ping him randomly, like, "What are you up to? Can we chat?" And then we weren't even good friends. We were just friendly. And when I decided to write the book, I reached out because he had such an interesting perspective on so many different topics that I reached out, and we became like the best of friends very quickly. But it was just a random meeting of me trying to sell to him and him having an impression that I just kept following and staying in touch with him, and then became friends like that.
Did he ever buy from you?
Yeah, I don't think he did, actually. I think you said that
time. Nice. So the book for our listeners is called Cybersecurity Sales, a buyer and seller's perspective. It's available on Amazon. Like, talk to me about that, Neil. You decided to write this book. Like, what was the inspiration for that? How'd you decide that this was something that needed to be out into the world?
So I read way too much. Anyone that knows me knows that I read about a book a week. And so most of it's on Audible, so don't be that impressed. It's listening while doing other things. But ultimately, I read a bunch of sales books. They were very interesting, but after a while, it kind of became, we'll call it 3% new. Every book was like, okay, I learned something. And then so I started to read books on specific topics, how to be a better presenter, words that stick, persuasion, even how to write better emails. And I started, as I got deeper in the world of cyber, I realized how unique it was, right? You're selling to people that are trained not to listen to you and to automatically not trust you. And so I thought, well, this is a pretty unique topic. I want to write it, but my inner non-narcissist said, who cares what Neil has to say? And so I thought, well, what does the world want to hear? I would want to hear what a buyer has to say. And so then I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to write a book on cybersecurity sales with a buyer's perspective. So I approached Anthony, and funny enough, my idea was to have him write a little bit of it. And Anthony said, no, that's not how this is going to work. It wasn't like, I'm going to do this. He was like, no, that's not how we're going to write this. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we're going to write it like as if we're watching a movie, and it's the main character and the sidekick story in every chapter, so that you get two different perspectives on how it works. And I was like, wow, what a brilliant idea. And so then I decided I should probably listen to more what Anthony had to say. And that's kind of
it sounds more eloquent when you describe it like that.
Nice. How long did it take you guys?
Maybe 6 months, probably a little less.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's dive into the questions here. Neil, you've been kind of in the top tier of sales reps at several companies. When you look at what separates incredible performance from mediocre performance, what are those things that the great reps do?
I mean, I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, which I've always taken to heart, is don't treat people like a transaction. I think the people that actually care and want to understand what the problem is and how to solve it, I think you find those people, going straight to the top. I think what's also interesting is you find the people that learn from others. There's a saying that plagiarism is copying from one, research is copying from many. And you find the people that do the research and start talking to everybody and figure out what they're doing right and build their own style in there. And I find that to be also another thing is when you look around the company and you say, who's been successful and why, and then you treat people like people, I think those are the combinations because there's so many variations. I could say this skill and that skill, but those are the general traits that I'm seeing of people that are wildly successful.
Why do you think, like, I feel like there's a de facto wisdom when you look at how things are done, just what companies are actually doing out there in the world. It feels like so many play a quantity game over a quality game that maybe doesn't allow for that research, that kind of humanity. It arguably it's getting even kind of worse or more common, commonplace with AI. Like if that is what separates the most successful from the average, why do you think that mindset is so pervasive?
Well, because it doesn't matter whether it's quantity or quality. It's if you're treating people like people, right? If I call everybody and have the same conversation, I think about charities. I get so many calls from charities. I'm the idiot that donated to 100 charities instead of one and gave them all my money. And so, the charities call and they start with the same thing: is this the head of household? Thank you for donating last year. And my first thought is, oh my God, like another one of these, right? And so what happens is when you treat people like people and you look it up, a quick Google search of, oh, Anthony started a company, or Anthony this or Anthony that, all of a sudden I've got something relevant. Or I can even start with crazy things like, we live in the same area. I don't want to be the person you avoid in the frozen food aisle when you're at the grocery store. Let's have a conversation. Doesn't matter what it is, but when you're treating them like people instead of going at them with your own intention, I think it makes a world of difference. So it doesn't matter if you know nothing or something. If I'm asking you a question about you or coming in with something that I think is relevant, is this relevant to you versus you need to know about this? I think it makes a world of difference.
I think one thing to also double click on that, right, is, I think this was one of the themes we tried to emphasize in the book, is that there's actually a lot of similarities um, in sellers and buyers, right? And it comes back down to the people component. Like, there's that saying, like, nobody wants to be sold, but everybody wants to buy,
Yep.
right? Um, and I think that really holds true, right? Nobody wants to be done with the transaction and be like, man, they sold me that, like, and you feel like you got sold something, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
But when you're like, man, I bought that, it's just a different level of empowerment stuff, right? And realizing that buyers and sellers, like, um, they're they're on the same spectrum. They're actually doing the same thing, right? Like, I talk about it all the time. Like, CISOs are salespeople, whether they agree, admit it or not. They're sales and they're marketing. They're marketing their cyber programs. They're selling the program to the rest of the organization, right? They have different responsibilities. They don't know they have a quota, right? But there is a quota of what they're supposed to deliver in cyber safety or whatever that is, right? Um, and so, like, being able to kind of understand that when you're selling to them, you can actually engage in that meaningful, that meaningful connection.
And Anthony, you were a CISO and a leader in security for so many years on the buyer side, and now you're helping cybersecurity companies improve their sales and marketing efforts. What didn't you have an appreciation for when you were on the buyer side that you kind of have a better understanding for now that you're looking at the world kind of from that similar but slightly different perspective?
Yeah. So when I was in role, I actually always had somebody or a team doing marketing, right? And I viewed it as as an important thing to be able to sell to get the support of the board, the CIO, and other IT folks, right? I did not understand just how important it really was, or really valuable it was, right? Like, and it's funny to kind of think about it. So, like, when I was at JP Morgan, had a $180 million year budget, right? You think about that as a P&L. Imagine having a $180 million company that does not have a marketing team or a sales team, right? And yes, you have an incumbent buyer, buyer who also has the option at any point to be like, we're just going to outsource this, right? But so many security leaders just kind of think about, like, no, they have to keep this here. We have to do this regular. They could outsource that. And if E&Y or PwC steps up their marketing better than what you are doing, like, you are in a world of hurt here, right? And so just understanding that, no, you are in sales, and you have to know your customer, like, know that, who are you selling to? You are in marketing, right? Like, making sure that, like, all of that stuff, I did not appreciate just how much there was an overlap.
And what did that look like internal to a company, internal to a security team? That internal kind of marketing lens and set of
Yeah,
activities.
absolutely. So like it would impact our reports, like fundamentally, right? So like I remember I did this initiative with one of my teams, and we mapped out like all the reports, pen testing reports, red team reports, various different things. And we start with, okay, well, who receives this report? And then be like, okay, well, it's this team. Well, where does it go from there? And ultimately it goes to some decision maker. And then when you looked at that end product, you'd be like, I would ask me, I'm like, if you were that CIO, would you buy that? And everyone's like, no, I wouldn't buy that. Like that's terrible. Like it's confusing. It's went through 10 different hands. It's not consistent, right? And so like understanding your customer, understanding the value prop, right? Like just even the messaging of getting people to understand and use security awareness and what that means.
Yeah.
And I think that sales and marketing professionals, like they get that a lot better. It just takes a lot of time for them to do that research and to understand it. And then, then they're trying to talk to so many different people, right? Which is why it comes back to someone like Neil, who actually builds great, meaningful relationships where instead of them buying from him in a transactional manner, right? Like, I'll ask Neil, like, I'm sure you get CISOs or people who reach out to you and they know you're selling product X, and they're like, hey, I know you don't sell this, but who's doing a good job out here, right? Is that
Yep.
fair?
Yeah. Yeah. It's trust factor. Absolutely.
100%. So, book came out a few years ago. You wrote it to emphasize several points. Since it came out, what do you think in our industry has changed for the better in terms of what companies are doing and how sales are approached?
I think collaboration has improved tremendously. I think that's a real focus on the industry that I won't say it was lacking because I think it always existed, but it seems like communities have been building left and right. And so it seems like there's more people coming together. I think there's a lot of distortion because there's so many vendors out there and there's so much noise. But overall, you're seeing a lot of these communities out there of different gatherings and different ways that people organize. And I think that continues to increase every day.
Awesome.
I,
Anthony?
I would add on to that though. I think a lot of these groups are forming like, hey, we all have the same job title. All right, cool. We're going to be in the Slack channel. And then like, they don't know what to do. Like it doesn't have a stickiness or like a real value factor. And so I think while collaboration is getting better, they're still figuring out like what they actually want out of that group. And like, hey, how do we actually help each other besides like just being in a group? And I think the other piece is that when COVID happened, everybody just went to volume on outbound, right? Yeah. They're like, okay, we can't do in-person events, so we get 1%, on outbound SDR. Let's just make it instead of 1% of 1,000, we're going to make it 1% of 1,000,000, right? Yeah. And then they just turned it up, and you've got this reaction from the security community that said, okay, inbound emails from vendors, we're just going to turn that off pretty much. We're yada yada. And now you have vendors that are approaching more of an account-based selling, where account-based marketing, where they're like, okay, blind volume doesn't work. Let me try to understand the buyer. And I think that we're seeing a lot more of that. Would you agree with that, Neil?
100%. That's actually a phenomenal point. I would say that's probably an even bigger change is that you're seeing people be a lot more strategic than they've ever been. We're definitely moving away from the ground and pound, the how much volume can I get? And now SDRs, BDRs, the volume based jobs are looking to be more strategic. And I think that's definitely a shift is that the noise got so loud that it became intolerable. And now you're seeing a lot more strategic being built in.
And so you think about that SDR and BDR role, and there's a lot of discussion in the sales community, is the SDR dead? What does that look like, right? Like how do you see lead gen evolving in this world? Because it's still tough, right? There are thousands of security companies out there. They're all looking for sales. They all need to spark conversations. They're all trying to assess if there's interest. What replaces the volume oriented, cold call and outbound? How do you guys see that evolving?
I don't think it goes away. I think it just becomes more strategic. I mean, prime example, obviously, we'll give Anthony a plug, right? Delve Risk is suddenly being used, and suddenly they're going in with real information and they're having real conversations, and you're finding that they're forced to be more educated. It's no longer I don't know what the dollar is, but we'll just pretend it's no longer a $500 a year job that any kid can do part time, and suddenly it's you've got to be educated, you've got to have a strategy as you go in. So I think it's just an evolving position, is all it is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we're excited about, right? Is that it becomes more and more table stakes, right? If all of your competitors are super well informed when they go talk to the prospect, like you have to make sure that your team is super well informed, right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of becomes this like arms race a little bit of who has the right information. And I think eventually, you get to a point of where like, okay, people are going to have the right information, the right, and then it'll be a different thing about like how do you, get more sticky. But I think the floor is being raised.
And I'm assuming that you kind of see that expectation changing on the buyer side too, like that threshold to have a conversation is going up because their time is precious, their time is valuable, and it's kind of the first hurdle of, are you a credible person to talk to? Is that like the right way to think about it?
I would say not only is that happening, but you're finding the conversations taking place at a lower level. You're finding CISOs becoming more of executives and managers taking on more responsibility. And so they're not only more educated, but they're having a conversation with somebody who cares a lot more about the bits and bytes of the conversation. So they have to be more educated. It's not just, if I went and talked to you about your house, it's going to be a very different conversation between you versus your children. And now suddenly we're talking about the children, about which cartoons they like and what toys they want to buy. It's you have to be more educated to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's interesting is sometimes you'll hear vendors like, well, the CISOs don't make the decisions, and in some cases that's true. But what I will say is this: is that if a security leader is unaware of your company, like not engaged with your leadership team, it's way easy for them to be like, no, like I've never heard of them. I'm not like so like there. Even though you're seeing, I think you are seeing more of the direct decisions being heavily championed by maybe a direct report of a CISO. That's secure. That executive decision maker still is on the hook for
Yeah.
if it goes right or wrong. And it's very rare are they going to buy something that's a couple $100,000 and they've not been involved at all.
But the likelihood of them starting the conversation has gone down.
Agreed.
That's the difference.
Totally agree. Right. So it is that penetrate and then level up.
Yep.
And you got to make sure you're ready and prepared for when you get that chance to level up.
That makes sense. And do you guys think that the tendency or the focus on platforms and the budgetary pressures that we've seen over the past couple of years, obviously that puts a certain pressure on kind of point solutions and nice to haves. Does it change the way we have to sell at all, or is it just more personalization, more value? Like, how does that impact the art of selling?
So it's funny you say that. Every company has a platform now, nobody has a product, and so it's kind of interesting how that's happened. Where I will say there's a lot of 2-for-1. How many things can you replace to get a product in there? And I think that is definitely shifting. I think we're shifting more back to best of breed as opposed to platform. I think platform still matters, but I don't think anybody wants to be single threaded. So if you can get everything you can out of X company that's huge, that's amazing. But you also want to know that if X fails, you still have Y and Z. And so I do think there's still a place for it. I think best of breed still matters very, very much, but it's, I don't know that it's shifted. I think it was shifting that direction very hard for a while. And then we kind of hit stop and said, hey, we really need to be a little bit more multi-threaded than singular.
Yeah, I think that people are also perhaps not realizing the psychological impact of things like the CrowdStrike event, right? You can talk about, well, that was a once in a blood and this and that, right? But when you have companies that were that impacted by a cyber vendor,
Yeah.
right?
And not even a security incident at that.
Not even a security incident.
Yeah.
Right. And like it becomes this really interesting piece of saying, hey, are we going to be all in on this, right? This vendor going down, and what does that look like, right? And I think it's the same thing that you have why so many organizations have a multi-cloud strategy, right? Like, hey, I trust Microsoft, but I trust Amazon, but like if there's an issue, like I have to get in line with my ticket number, and I'm a Fortune 100 company in line, right? Whereas 10 years ago, the CIO would just literally go wrangle the neck of whoever was in charge of the data center and be like, "What did you do?" Right? Like you can't do that, right? Like you sit there and hold your ticket mad. But and so I think that vendors or enterprises are really thinking about like, how do we distribute this risk a little bit, and what does that look like, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's talk about relationships. Neil, this is something you're great at. Anthony described it as your superpower. What are your secrets? What do you do? What are your tactics? How do you make this happen?
Well, so I'll give you a tactic, but I'll tell you that it's definitely my nature to actually care about people in general. I jokingly say I look at the world and say, "Look how great it is," and my wife looks at her shadow and says, "I think it's trying to kill me." And so that's why we're married, right? Is there's a big mix of that. But one of the tactics I've always used that I think helps is learning something new about each person. So I take the example of initially I'll ask a question. What do you do when you're not at work, or do you have kids, or I don't know, pick any stuff. Do you like sports, whatever it is, and then I try to remember something about it. So if somebody tells me they go skiing in Denver every year, if I see something, it reminds me to ping them and say, "Hey, do you know this was happening in Denver?" Or you mentioned you love Star Wars. Do you see the new thing coming out on Disney? And so I try to keep something personal in mind that they care about, because it's really funny. I mean, I see it with text messages all the time where I'll text people just to say, "Hey, I was thinking about you." And I get an instant response back if it's something they care about. If it's, "I want to sell you a product," it sits in the back burner for 3 days and it's, "Hey, sorry, I forgot to respond." But if I tell you that, Han Solo is going to die in the next Star Wars episode, I get back, "How'd you find that out?" Like, it's like all of a sudden you're like, so you find that the personal stuff makes a difference, and remembering that shows that you actually care about the person. And so that's one of the tactics I use is, and I do it, to be very clear, not in a tricky way. Like if you do it in a way that's not authentic, I think it shows. But if you're actually paying attention, like it matters.
I think that's the big thing, like when it comes to Neil, and it's a skill I think that people can develop. The reason why I say it's Neil's superpower is that it's just natural to him, right? He was telling me about, I think it was a CISO. He was telling me about he met this guy, and then what was it, a couple months back, and you were just like talking about hockey and the kids
Yeah.
hockey and this and that, and then like maybe you knew he was a security leader, or maybe you found out later. And then I was like, "Oh, well, we just spent a couple hours talking about kids hockey and travel hockey and all that stuff, right?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just becomes this natural bit. Now, I would say if it's not natural to somebody, right?
Yeah.
You have to actually fight your urge to want to tell them about your thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well,
and
and
that's
that's a huge point. I mean, and you're right. It's, and I've always said that to other, like when I mentor younger reps, I always say you have to be yourself, right? Like I love I love a good dad joke. I tell terrible jokes and I think they're the funniest thing ever. And I laugh all day at them. But if that's not you and you tell a terrible joke and it's more awkward for them than it is for you, right? And so you gotta be you. And I was taught early on in my career that when you write an email or you make a phone call, think about how you'd receive it. So if you write an email, read it out loud and think, would I want to read this? And so I try to do that with every conversation. Think about what the consequence is to my action if I say this. And I'm definitely not perfect. My wife will tell you I'm not even close, but I try to think about the consequences of what I'm doing. And when you're in that conversation, you're being naturally you. It's a lot easier than if you're forcing yourself to be something you're not.
yeah.
That makes sense. Um, where do you think about the extensibility of relationships, right? Like I used to work for a VAR that very much is a relationship business, and you will
Yeah.
see that sales rep and customer relationship travel around to various different companies, right?
Yep.
On the other hand, I think if you're selling a product and it's a $15,000 ARR, you're in a volume game, right? And it's going to be much harder to kind of have personal relationships that are enduring. Like, how do you think about where that's relevant? and really where for folks that have that skill, think about where and how to apply that, and maybe for folks where that just doesn't come as naturally, or it's sort of harder to build that muscle, like how should they think about their careers in light of that skill?
Yeah, so first I'll take it the opposite direction and say that most people assume because I have relationships, I'm afraid to sell them, which makes me chuckle. You're afraid to ask the tough questions. I've had more sales engineers tell me I make the awkward conversations comfortable than I can tell you because I don't mind asking the tough questions. I think, the relationship gets you the conversation, but value gets you the sale. And I
Yeah.
think that's huge in that, I would never buy something I don't want or need. It doesn't matter how close you are. Like I buy Girl Scout cookies, which I don't need. So I guess there's a dollar amount where where that may get you by. But in general, I think if you don't need something, you're not going to buy it regardless who brings it to you. The relationship gets the door open. You still have to sell value. And I think what you're mentioning of the reseller world, what generally happens that's different than the vendor world is that they go in and say, "What do you need?" versus the vendor says, "Do you need this thing?" And
Yeah.
so I think you have to respect the answer. And I think that's the challenge. You can't assume that they just don't get it. And I think that's the mistake a lot of people make with the relationships. It's like, well, I know Anthony, so Anthony's going to buy this. When Anthony says no, well, Anthony, let me explain it to you another way. And I think that's where the relationships seem to sort of break down. Is if you don't believe Anthony knows, then do you have enough respect to really be Anthony's friend, right? And that's what I would say is the relationship will open the door, but you still have to respect the responses you get and not butcher the relationship just because you want to sell them something.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny. So like when I started Delve Risk, I I made a conscious effort for the most part that I would not sell to people I knew. One, because I thought that they would give me a pass on like product, be like, hey, it's not that great, but I mean, hey, but it's funny now, 5 years later, I've got people reaching out being like, hey man, I just saw this thing. I didn't realize that that's what you were doing. How come you never sold it to me? Because I could really use this, right? Because I didn't want to convert on the when it was too early, and I think there's that fine balance of making sure people know like what you're doing and how you add value, very specifically perhaps to what you're selling, but then recognizing that you're adding value in a bunch of other different ways, right? So when they're reaching out to you, like I mentioned earlier, people hitting up Neil and being like, hey, you know somebody that's a really good solution for this, and he might be like, yeah, I know, because they view Neil as a resource, a trusted resource.
Yep.
So then when it comes time for this space of what he's actually selling, oh yeah, I know the guy who can help you guys with it, right? And it's the difference though between farming and hunting, right? And I think that that's part of the problem that a lot of venture-backed startups have is they hire people and they're like, we need hunters who are going to go kill something this quarter, right? And it's like, okay, but it's relationship-based selling, so we're farming really, and you need people who've been farming for a long time already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. Um, what, we talked about a few things that companies are, tend to do, or conventional wisdom that doesn't make sense. If you guys could end a few tactics that you commonly see out there in the cybersecurity space, what would you kill? What would you put a bullet in?
I mean, for me, I would say don't assume that you know more than everybody. And I know that's a human trait, not a security trait, but there are a lot of people out there that just assume that people just aren't getting it. And I think the problem is we're not positioning it appropriately. So we're in a world of automation. We've reached the point where we don't want to talk to a grocery store clerk. We'd rather go through the lane and check it out ourselves. And so that's what everybody's trying to buy now is automation. How do we build something we don't have to think about? And so I think if we could be more prescriptive on if you want to hit this compliance, we check off box 8, 9, and 10, but we don't hit the first 7. I think that would be huge. And I'm not even claiming that I'm good at that because that's something I need to get to. But I find that most people's assumption is that everybody should know. Everybody should know. I told you that we're better. I told you we're a platform. I told you we use AI. Why don't you know that you need this product? And so that would be the first thing I think I would change is don't assume everybody knows what you're trying to tell them. You are responsible for making sure they understand where you fit.
Yeah, I think the assumption is one thing I notice a lot, and this is particularly with startups, is that you have really smart people who've come up with something, that's smart, and they just naturally assume everybody else is smart,
Yep.
right? And I'm not saying everybody else is dumb, but they're assuming, they're like, oh no, once I talk to them about this, they're just going to totally get it, and then they'll buy the thing. And it's like, no, you actually have to understand like their particular situation, use case, how it's going to work in their environment, right? And so I think that to Neil's point, you just can't assume everybody is there. But also, the worst thing is actually the FUD. The fact that we still have this fear, uncertainty, and doubt sales component in 2024 is wild to me, right? And I can tell you the buyers don't appreciate it at all, right? Like it's like,
Yeah.
Is it just the lazy button? Like, why is it happening? Right?
It's a storyline. It's a storyline because the story goes, here's the problem, here's what I solve. And so the easy thing to say is that, it's the Wild West. 100 of your soldiers were shot last month. What are you going to do about it? And the easy button is these 100 soldiers were shot, and you were lucky enough that only 5 of them were in your regime. And so that's where you go with like, hey, look at this problem. Here's how we're going to solve. So it adds the storyline, but the problem is that everybody's reading the storyline every day anyway, so you really can skip the first chapter.
Yeah.
and it's I think that we've been desensitized to a lot of it, right? It's if you think about like 15 years ago, everybody's like, oh my gosh, you can't have a breach. If you had a breach, this and that, right? Everyone expected, oh my goodness, every time you were breached at a retailer, nobody's going to shop there anymore. Like, if you track it, I think there's only been 1 or 2 cyber breaches where the stock price dipped and stayed low. Everything else is like rebounded way past, right?
Yep.
So then you're like, okay, well, we can't use that narrative anymore. So it's this piece of like, okay, how do we try to incentivize them, somehow? And fear is an easy way to do it, right?
Yeah.
But it's also, I think it is a lazy one. And then you're selling and you're being sold to, like, and that's that nobody wants to be sold to. I think that's an
Well,
important piece.
but the irony though, also with the fear part, is that when I first got in this industry, I used to look at it like the Wild West. I was like, who's getting shot and how do I protect them? And then you start talking to people in the seat, and they're like, oh, the risk to the business is this. It's not who's getting shot. It's we want to move to the cloud. What could
Yep.
happen? And it's like, so they're saying if you want to do it safely, here's what you do. And I'm coming in and saying, don't get shot. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so it's like it's not the same conversation.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I see is I think there's tremendous pressure, particularly early on, for companies to say something that doesn't actually reflect what the delivery experience is. I think there's a lot of bullshit marketing out there. And so my question for you, we spoke about the importance of trust in relationships and credibility, and in the risk that you put on the line when you sell whatever it is that you have in the bag to somebody that you've built a relationship with and built trust with. How do you do your diligence when you think about going to a new company to suss out whether the claims are real, the value prop is there, the upside's there in the market? How do you get underneath that? Because I think there's a lot of salespeople out there that get frustrated by having to toe a line when that's not what they're hearing on the other side of customer experience.
It depends on the size of the company, right? So if it's an established company, it's easy to go ask people, what was your experience? If it's a startup, it's tough to do. So I typically will take somebody and I trust that's pretty technical and say, rip this apart and tell me what you think. Like, let's do a demo. Let's look at it. Tell me if you'd buy this, why you would, why you wouldn't. And then that's generally the best route I go. But I'm very honest for whatever reason. I'm scared of telling a lie because I think my mom will still punish me. And so, I constantly will ask, things like, I'll make a comment like, "Hey, I've only been here a couple months. Everything I've seen, it's amazing, but I can't tell you honestly that this is perfect until we go through it together." Like I'll be pretty transparent about it because I don't want to stake my reputation on something if I haven't seen it be successful. So I will say, like, the concept is amazing, the product's awesome. We've gone through proof of concepts. I've seen this. We have these customers, but here's where we're at. I try to be very transparent about where we're at. I don't try to tell you that Johnson and Johnson, Amazon have deployed it if they haven't. Like I'm not gonna try to make that statement if it's not true.
I think that there's 3 parts of what people buy, right? And one part is absolutely what you're delivering today, right? And a lot of times sellers and I think even some executives are like, no, I'm just buying. Can they meet the thing? And some people only buy on that. But for the most part, I think they buy. That's only one part of it. The second part, especially when it comes to startups, is the future state, right? They're like, okay, I'm buying the future state. I'm future selling a little bit. And like every startup has, hey, this is what we do, and this is what we are going to do, right? So when you're a buyer, you're buying a bit of that future state as well. But the third thing is you're buying it's really, it comes down to the trust of like, if Neil's selling it to me, right? Do I trust he's going to be able to bridge that future to the future state, right? And so I think it's those three components that really matter. And if one of those breaks down, right, I'm like, okay, I love the future state. I like what I got today, but I don't think Neil's going to get me there, or that his company's going to get me there. I'm probably not going to buy, right?
Yeah.
So if any one of those three things breaks down, I think that can actually implode a deal.
Yeah.
And the hard part is that if you don't have the relationship and you haven't been building it, then it's hard to convey that trust. To be like, right, like if Neil's like, hey, they're here today, we're going here. I've known Neil, I trust him. I'm gonna be like, well, I mean, I don't see how he connects the dots, but if he says it, I trust him. Let's go, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of every buying decision.
100%. 100%. Kind of on that theme of going to where the selling is good. Any thoughts as you look out into the market over the next 3 years of spaces or areas where, as people think about their career decisions, you'd say, check this out. This is an area where I think there's going to be some need, and you could experience some success, in part by being surrounded in the right place, the right environment, the right problems to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the old answer is cloud, right? Which is where everything is moving to. Even those that were totally opposed to it are mostly there now. There's very few companies aren't there. So I would say the first thing I would check is make sure that you're doing the same thing in the cloud you are on-prem. You can't just be an on-prem solution anymore. So I think this point, that's almost automatic and necessary. And I would say, again, outcome-based selling, right? So it's more of where are you taking them to, and is the product getting to an outcome they need to get to than it is the product itself. So if it's 10 products or one, does it solve a real problem people have today, or is it just a better widget than what was there before? Because the better widgets aren't as important anymore as the outcome is. It's EDR used to replace AV, and now it's like you expect whatever your endpoint solution is to have everything built into one. So I think it's the outcome you're looking for and less the solution.
I think one thing that's important, though, is that we are not in the same heyday that we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So just because somebody was a phenomenal seller, like I won't say which vendor, but they were, they're in the SIM space, and they're like, yeah, I completely discount everything they did when that seller sold at Splunk, because you didn't have to do anything. Like everyone just kind of showed up and was like, oh, hey, I need to buy this, and whereas today, I think sellers actually need to have a process that they're sticking to, being consistent, proactively building the relationships. And you can't just be like, oh, we're the new whiz bang thing, and we came out with this much money, and all these people are going to buy. They actually have to go understand, solve the problem. And I think that's one of the things that people need to look at when they're looking to hire sellers, right, in marketing teams, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit different.
All right. Last question here before we do the roundup. Lightning rounds. I'm looking for a quick take on a couple of topics. Where are we as an industry on thinking about risk versus compliance?
That's an interesting one. That's probably better for Anthony than me to answer. But I would say that I think risk is now the primary conversation because business is talking about risk. I think compliance is going to matter because it costs money. But I think every conversation is risk-based, whether cyber's in it or not.
Yeah, I think compliance has turned into a government risk equation, right? So people are complying because there's the risk of government fees and penalties, et cetera, right? Like, that's all compliance is for the most part.
All right, second one, targeting and applying sales and marketing tactics based on precision and insight versus volume. Where are we?
I think we've moved very, very quickly to precision. I think I mean, I've sat in conversations with SDRs and entire teams, and I think that's definitely a big topic right now.
Yeah, I agree, right? I think volume doesn't actually get you over the line anymore.
Yeah. What about actually good use of AI in helping support marketing and sales efforts? Where are we?
I think we're in the infancy. I think it's the conversation in every single business, but I think everybody's still trying to figure out what it means. There's all these rules and restrictions being added to what you can and can't do. I think we're just touching the surface of that right now.
Yeah, I think that what you're going to see more and more is curated stuff like what we're building with Delvist. I think the aspect of AI hallucinates too much. When you're starting to use LLMs, it gets really wonky, and I think there's some RAG that you could use, but it's going to be a combination of how good your data is inside your company to train your models to make better decisions on, right?
100%. All right, guys, it's time for the roundup. Anthony, do you have a hot take or a takeaway from the conversation today?
Yeah, I would say, especially for people who are in sales and like building the long-term relationships, right? Like understanding that you need to be a farmer, start farming, and eventually it all works out, right? At early stage, you got to do some hunting. I'm sure I get it, but like farming is the way you actually build a meaningful relationship in sales.
Yep. All right, Neil, what about you?
I would say that, I mean, again, in the theme of collaboration, right? You look at you, you look at Anthony, you look at me, and we have very different backgrounds, and I think these conversations matter. And I think being able to have a diverse conversation from different angles to a topic, I think it'll get you a lot further than talking to like-minded people. The more you have a conversation with people that think just like you, the outcome doesn't change. So I think these conversations where you come at it from different angles make a world of difference because you start thinking about things a little bit differently.
Yeah. And for me, I love that conversation about relationships. And I think there's so much in the ethos right now, product-led growth, buyers don't want to talk to sales reps. What can we automate that adds to quantity and adds to noise and adds to actually the value of real human connections? And so that ability to build those relationships and nurture those relationships and build that trust, I think is actually only going to become more important in that world that we live in. Well, awesome. Neil, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to have you here. This was fun. As always, Hack and Hustle is brought to you by Crux, the talent marketplace for cybersecurity.
And Delve Risk. We are super, super happy to have had you, Neil. Like I just got to interrupt, but love it. This is always fun.
It's been a good time. Thanks, guys.
For our audience, if there's any questions you'd like to have answered or topics you'd like us to cover, drop us a line at pod@crux.so, and we'll see you next week.